September 15th, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The dust hung thick in the air as a transport truck rumbled through the gates, carrying something no American POW camp had ever seen before. 3 German women in military uniforms stepped down onto foreign soil, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Ingrid, 21. Liesel, 19. Greta, 23. Wehrmacht auxiliaries who had spent years hearing that Americans were savage monsters who would torture any German they captured. Yet here they stood, being offered blankets and hot coffee by their captors. The women exchanged bewildered glances as Staff Sergeant Smokey Joe Johnson approached their quarters one evening, carrying plates of something that smelled unlike anything in their war-torn world. Memphis-style barbecue ribs, glazed and tender, smoke still rising from the meat. When Liesel took her first bite, tears streamed down her face. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that their enemies had just shown them more kindness than they'd known in years of war. But first, hit that subscribe button for more incredible untold stories from history. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. These stories connect us all across the world. The dust cloud behind the transport truck settled slowly in the September heat, leaving 3 figures standing uncertainly beside their meager belongings on the hard-packed earth of Camp Concordia. Ingrid Weber pulled her Wehrmacht auxiliary jacket tighter around her shoulders, a gesture more of habit than warmth in the Kansas afternoon. At 21, she had learned to read situations quickly during her months as a radio operator, and what she saw here defied everything she had been told about American prisoner of war camps. The guards weren't sneering. They weren't shouting orders or brandishing weapons. Instead, they stood at a respectful distance, their rifles held casually, almost carelessly. One of them, a young man with sun-bleached hair and kind eyes, actually tipped his cap when he caught her looking. "Guten Tag," he said in heavily accented German, and Ingrid blinked in surprise. She had expected harsh commands in a foreign tongue, not this fumbling attempt at courtesy. Beside her, Liesel Hoffman shifted nervously, her medical bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The 19-year-old had been quiet during their journey from the processing center in New York, her wide blue eyes taking in everything with the careful attention of someone who had learned that details could mean the difference between safety and danger. Now, she whispered, "They seem different than we were told." Greta Muller stood rigid, her chin raised in defiance despite their circumstances. The 23-year-old intelligence clerk had maintained her military bearing throughout their capture and transport, refusing to show weakness even when exhaustion threatened to buckle her knees. "Don't be fooled," she muttered in German, loud enough for their escorts to hear. "This is probably just for show." A tall man in captain's bars approached them, his step measured and deliberate. Robert Harrison had been camp administrator for 8 months, long enough to develop routines for processing new prisoners, but never long enough to prepare for this moment. Female prisoners of war were uncharted territory, and his carefully ordered world of regulations and protocols offered little guidance. "Ladies," he said, removing his cap with the same practiced courtesy he might show to church-going women back in Iowa. "I'm Captain Harrison. I'll be overseeing your accommodation here at Camp Concordia." He paused, clearly struggling with the unprecedented nature of the situation. "I want you to know that you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention and with the dignity that any person deserves." Ingrid found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception. In Hamburg, she had learned to read the micro-expressions of Nazi officials, to detect when kindness was performance and when cruelty lurked beneath polite words. But Harrison's weathered features showed only a kind of earnest confusion, as if he were working through a complex problem with insufficient information. "We've prepared special quarters for you in the former medical building," Harrison continued, gesturing toward a white-painted structure set apart from the main prisoner barracks. "You'll have privacy and appropriate facilities. Tomorrow we'll discuss work assignments, but for now I imagine you're tired from your journey." As they walked toward their new home, Ingrid couldn't help but notice the other prisoners visible through the chain-link fences. German soldiers, most of them, working in gardens or sitting in the shade playing cards. They looked healthy, well-fed even. Some waved when they spotted the women, calling out greetings and questions in rapid German. The guards made no move to stop them. "How long have you been here?" Liesel called back to a group of prisoners near the fence. "6 months," one replied, a middle-aged man with laugh lines around his eyes. "The food is good, and they let us write letters home. It's not so bad, little sister." Greta's jaw tightened. "Collaborators," she said under her breath, but Ingrid noticed her step had lost some of its military stiffness. Their quarters proved to be a revelation. 3 cots with clean blankets, a table and chairs, even a small shelf for personal items. Through the window, Ingrid could see a kitchen garden where prisoners worked alongside American soldiers, their conversation audible even at this distance. The sound of laughter carried on the warm air. "There's soap," Liesel said wonderfully, examining the wash basin. "Real soap, not that ersatz stuff." "And towels," Ingrid added, touching the rough but clean fabric with something approaching reverence. In their last weeks in France, luxuries, like clean towels, had become distant memories. Captain Harrison cleared his throat from the doorway. "Meals are served in the main dining hall at 0700, 1200, and 1800 hours. You're welcome to eat with the other prisoners, or arrangements can be made for private dining if you prefer. The camp library is open daily, and we have English classes if you're interested." "English classes?" Liesel's voice held a note of wonder. "Many of our prisoners express interest in learning. We find it helps with adjustment." Harrison seemed to choose his words carefully. "There's also a camp newsletter if you'd like to contribute. Some prisoners write about their hometowns, share recipes, that sort of thing." After he left, the 3 women sat in silence, absorbing the impossible reality of their situation. Outside their window, the sounds of camp life continued, not the harsh bellowing of guards or the cries of brutalized prisoners they had been led to expect, but the ordinary sounds of men making the best of their circumstances. Someone was playing a harmonica, the melody drifting on the evening air. "What kind of prison camp has a newsletter?" Greta asked finally, her voice stripped of its earlier defiance. Ingrid moved to the window, watching as an American sergeant distributed mail to a group of eager prisoners. The joy on their faces as they recognized familiar handwriting was unmistakable, universal. "Maybe," she said slowly, "we don't know as much about Americans as we thought we did." But even as she spoke the words, a deeper uncertainty settled in her chest. If they had been wrong about this, what else might they have been wrong about? And in the distance, barely noticeable above the harmonica's gentle tune, she caught the scent of wood smoke and something else, something rich and unfamiliar that would, in time, change everything they thought they knew about their captors, their enemies, and themselves. Their first week at Camp Concordia established a rhythm that felt both foreign and oddly comforting. Each morning at 6:30, a gentle knock on their door announced the start of another day that defied every expectation they had carried across the Atlantic. The knock itself was a small mercy. No shouting, no banging, just Corporal Matthew's soft Carolina drawl calling, "Morning, ladies, breakfast in 30 minutes if you're ready." Ingrid had appointed herself their unofficial timekeeper, rising before the others to wash and dress in the growing light filtering through their window. The routine gave her a sense of control in circumstances that should have left her feeling powerless. As she buttoned her auxiliary uniform, cleaned and mended now, thanks to the camp's surprisingly efficient laundry, she watched Liesel emerge from dreams with the same wonder she had shown since their arrival. "The birds are different here," Liesel murmured, listening to the unfamiliar songs outside their window. "Everything sounds more hopeful somehow." Greta remained skeptical, dressing with military precision while maintaining her armor of suspicion. "Birds sing the same everywhere," she said curtly. "Don't let sentimentality cloud your judgment." But even Greta couldn't entirely dismiss the reality of their treatment. Their work assignments, processing paperwork in the camp administration building and sorting supplies in the quartermaster's warehouse, were hardly the brutal labor they had been warned to expect. The American staff treated them with a professional courtesy that bordered on deference, and their fellow German prisoners had welcomed them with a mixture of protective concern and genuine curiosity about conditions outside the camp. It was in the laundry, their afternoon assignment, that the first real cracks began to show in Greta's defensive walls. The work was monotonous but not demanding, sorting, washing, folding endless loads of uniforms and linens. The industrial washing machines were a marvel to Liesel, who had grown up helping her grandmother with laundry day that involved hauling water and heating it over wood fires. "Look how clean everything gets," she marveled, holding up a sheet that gleamed white in the afternoon sun streaming through the laundry windows. "And so quickly." "American efficiency," Ingrid observed, though she found herself equally impressed by the mechanical precision of the equipment. In Hamburg, their family had considered themselves fortunate to have running water. Machines that washed and spun clothing dry seemed like something from a fantasy. It was while folding towels that they first caught the scent that would haunt their dreams and challenge their understanding of their captors. The smell drifted through the laundry's open windows on a Friday afternoon breeze, rich, smoky, complex in ways that made their mouths water involuntarily. "What is that?" Liesel asked, pausing mid-fold to breathe deeply. Corporal Jackson, the young black soldier who supervised their afternoon shift, looked up from his paperwork with a grin that transformed his serious face. "That's Smoky Joe working his magic," he said with obvious pride. "Friday afternoon means weekend prep time. You haven't lived until you've tasted Sergeant Johnson's barbecue." "Barbecue?" Ingrid tested the unfamiliar English word, pronouncing it carefully. "It's like—" Jackson paused, clearly searching for words to explain something that seemed fundamental to his understanding of the world. "It's cooking meat real slow over wood smoke. Takes hours, but when it's done right, it's like eating a piece of heaven." Greta snorted dismissively, but Ingrid noticed she had stopped folding to listen. "Waste of time and resources," Greta said, "typical American excess." But Jackson's expression grew serious, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made all three women pay attention. "Sergeant Johnson's from Memphis. Been cooking since he could. Barely see over a stove. His grandmother taught him, and her grandmother before that. It ain't excess when it's about taking care of folks, making something special out of whatever you got." He paused, then added quietly, "Especially when your boy's somewhere across the ocean, hoping somebody over there might show him the same kind of kindness." The words hung in the air between them, creating a connection none of them had expected. For the first time, Greta's mask slipped entirely, revealing something vulnerable beneath the rigid military bearing. "You have a son fighting?" she asked softly. "Smoky Joe does," Jackson clarified. "Tommy Johnson somewhere in Italy last we heard. 20 years old, looks just like his daddy, but taller." He smiled, but it was edged with worry. "Joe says cooking for folks here helps him feel like he's doing something good in the world while his boy's doing the hard work of fighting." That evening, as they walked back to their quarters, the smoky scent seemed to follow them, weaving through their conversation and their silence alike. Even Greta seemed subdued, her usual sharp commentary replaced by thoughtful quiet. "He seems kind," Liesel said finally, referring to Jackson. "They all do, really. How is that possible?" Ingrid had been wrestling with the same question. Everything they had been taught about Americans painted them as either weak and decadent or brutally efficient killers. The reality she was witnessing daily fit neither description. These men seemed ordinary in the most extraordinary way. Decent people doing their jobs with competence and unexpected grace. "Maybe," she said carefully, testing the words even as she spoke them, "maybe we weren't told the whole truth about a lot of things." Greta stopped walking so abruptly that both women turned to look at her. In the fading light, her face was pale, her eyes haunted by something deeper than their current circumstances. "If we were wrong about this," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "what else were we wrong about?" It was the question none of them wanted to face directly, but it hung between them as they reached their quarters. Inside, Liesel moved immediately to the window that faced the kitchen area, breathing deeply of air that still carried traces of that mysterious, wonderful smell. "Whatever he's cooking," she said with quiet determination, "I want to understand it. I want to understand all of this." As if summoned by her words, the sound of men's laughter drifted across the compound, warm and genuine. Somewhere among those voices was the man they called Smoky Joe, preparing food with the same care and attention their own grandmothers had once brought to family meals. The thought should have felt like betrayal, comparing their captors to family, but instead it felt like the first honest thing any of them had acknowledged since their arrival. Outside their window, the Kansas evening settled around the camp like a blanket, and the scent of wood smoke and slow-cooked meat promised possibilities they weren't quite ready to name. The opportunity to prove their worth came unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning in early October when Corporal Matthews arrived at their quarters with unusual urgency, replacing his typical gentle courtesy. His face was tight with worry as he knocked, and when Ingrid opened the door, she immediately sensed something had shifted in the careful balance of their daily routine. "Ladies, I need to ask a favor," he said, his Carolina drawl strained. "My little girl, Sarah, she's taken sick with a fever that won't break. The base doctor's in town delivering a baby and won't be back until tonight. I know one of you has medical training." Liesel stepped forward without hesitation, her medical bag already in hand, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "How old is your daughter?" she asked in careful English, the words she had been practicing in their evening language lessons finally finding purpose. "7," Matthews replied, relief flooding his features. "She's burning up something fierce, and my wife's beside herself with worry." The walk to the married enlisted quarters took them beyond the familiar boundaries of their restricted world, past gardens where German prisoners worked alongside American soldiers in an easy camaraderie that still surprised Ingrid daily. Children played in dusty yards between the small houses, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. It was a glimpse into a life that seemed impossibly normal given their circumstances. Sarah Matthews lay listless on her narrow bed, her cheeks flushed with fever, her small body radiating heat that had clearly terrified her parents beyond reason. Mrs. Matthews, a slight woman with worried eyes and calloused hands, hovered beside the bed with the desperate helplessness of a mother watching her child suffer. Liesel approached the bedside with the quiet confidence that had made her invaluable in the field hospitals of Bavaria. She spoke softly to the little girl in English, her accent thick but her manner universally reassuring. "Hello, Sarah. My name is Liesel. I am going to help you feel better, yes?" The examination was thorough but gentle, Liesel's trained hands checking pulse, listening to breathing, feeling for swollen glands with the systematic care she had learned from her grandmother and refined through months of treating wounded soldiers. Sarah submitted to the examination with the trusting stillness of a sick child who recognizes competent care. "Not serious," Liesel announced finally, and both parents visibly sagged with relief. "Is what you call, how do you say, ear infection. The fever comes from pain in ear. We make poultice, give willow bark tea, and she will be better in 2 days." Mrs. Matthews burst into tears, grabbing Liesel's hands with desperate gratitude. "Oh, thank you, I was so scared. Are you sure? How do you know?" "I am trained medical aid," Liesel explained simply. "In my country, before war, I helped my grandmother who is, how you say, healer. We know these sicknesses in children." What followed was a revelation in cross-cultural cooperation. Liesel directed Mrs. Matthews in preparing the herbal remedies that had been passed down through generations of Bavarian healers, while Corporal Matthews hurried to gather the necessary supplies. Ingrid found herself translating when Liesel's English faltered, and even Greta contributed by helping to hold the squirming child still during treatment. As the afternoon wore on and Sarah's fever began to break, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere around them. Word of Liesel's intervention had spread through the small community, and neighbors began stopping by with offerings of gratitude, fresh-baked cookies, garden vegetables, even hand-knitted mittens for the approaching winter. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Matthews whispered to her husband, thinking the women couldn't understand. "She saved our baby. A German woman saved our Sarah." The words hit each of them differently. Ingrid felt a quiet satisfaction at being seen as capable rather than dangerous. Greta struggled with emotions she couldn't quite name, pride at Liesel's competence warring with confusion about their role as enemies who were being treated with such gratitude. But for Liesel, the moment represented something even more profound. "In Bavaria," she said softly to Mrs. Matthews, "my grandmother always say that sickness has no nationality. A child who hurts is just a child who hurts." That evening, Captain Harrison made an unprecedented visit to their quarters. His usual formal demeanor had softened into something approaching warmth, and he carried with him a letter that would change everything. "Ladies," he began, settling into the chair they offered with the careful courtesy that had become routine between them. "I wanted to personally thank you for your assistance today. Mrs. Matthews tells me that young Sarah is already much improved." "Is what anyone would do," Liesel said simply, but Harrison shook his head. "No, it's not. What you did today went beyond duty or even basic humanity. You saw a child in need and responded with skill and compassion, despite having every reason to feel no obligation to help us." He paused, weighing his words carefully. "I've written a commendation for your files, and I've also written to the Red Cross about your medical qualifications. They may be interested in having you assist with refugee processing when the time comes." The implications hung in the air between them. For the first time, someone was speaking of their futures beyond captivity, of roles they might play in rebuilding rather than simply surviving. But it was his next words that truly opened their world. "I've also spoken with Sergeant Johnson about extending weekend meal privileges to include you three. If you're interested, you're welcome to join the Saturday evening gatherings." Greta looked up sharply. "The barbecue?" Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Among other things, yes. Joe's been curious about German cooking, and I thought perhaps there might be some interesting exchanges possible." After he left, they sat in contemplative silence, each processing the day's events in her own way. Through their window, the familiar scent of wood smoke drifted on the evening air, but now it carried different associations. Not the smell of their captor's excess, but the aroma of hospitality being extended across the impossible divide of war. "Everything's changing," Liesel said finally, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. Ingrid nodded, understanding that they stood at a threshold they hadn't even known existed. "Yes," she agreed. "Everything." The letter from the Red Cross arrived on a Thursday morning that had dawned bright and promising, carrying with it the first genuine hope the three women had felt since their capture. Ingrid held the thin paper with trembling fingers, reading aloud the formal language that spoke of processing assignments, potential early repatriation for those with medical training, and the possibility of meaningful work helping other displaced persons find their way home. "They want me to help interview German civilians," Liesel said wonderingly, her voice catching on the words, "to help them understand American procedures for getting back to their families." Even Greta seemed affected by the news, her usual skepticism giving way to something that might have been cautious optimism. "It's real work," she admitted. "Important work." But their celebration was short-lived. That afternoon, as they returned from their duties in the administration building, they found Captain Harrison waiting in their quarters with an expression that immediately put them on guard. His weathered face was drawn with exhaustion, and the letter in his hands shook almost imperceptibly as he held it. "Ladies," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with words that refused to come easily. "I need to share some difficult news with you." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the weight of unspoken fears. Through their window, they could hear the ordinary sounds of camp life continuing, men working in the gardens, the distant clatter of kitchen preparation, Corporal Matthews calling to his daughter as she played in their yard. Normal life, carrying on despite whatever darkness was about to enter their small sanctuary. "Reports have been coming in," Harrison continued finally, his voice carefully controlled, "from our forces advancing into Germany. What they're finding, what your countrymen have done—" He stopped again, visibly collecting himself. "There are places called concentration camps. Camps where millions of innocent people have been murdered. Children, families, entire communities." The words hit them like physical blows. Greta went white, her hand flying to her mouth as if to hold back something that wanted to escape. Liesel made a small sound of distress, her eyes filling with tears she didn't yet understand. But it was Ingrid who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. How many? We don't know yet. Thousands, certainly. Hundreds of thousands. Maybe more. Harrison's words fell into the room like stones into deep water, sending ripples of horror through everything they thought they knew about their homeland, their cause, their very identity. That's impossible, Greta said fiercely, but her voice lacked conviction. Those are propaganda lies, allied fabrication to justify— No. Harrison's interruption was gentle but implacable. I've seen the photographs. I've read the reports from our own officers, men I've served with for years. This is real, and it's been happening for years while the world looked away. The silence that followed was different from any they had shared before, deeper, more profound, as if the very foundation of their understanding had shifted beneath their feet. Everything they had believed, everything they had served, everything that had given their lives meaning during the long years of war crumbled in the space between Harrison's words. I wanted you to hear this from me, Harrison continued, his voice heavy with compassion they didn't feel they deserved. Because changes are coming. The American public is learning about these camps too, and there's anger, righteous anger. Orders are coming down to reduce prisoner privileges, to impose stricter restrictions. Ingrid felt the room spinning around her, the walls of their small sanctuary suddenly feeling like a prison after weeks of feeling like protection. What does that mean for us? Honestly, I don't know yet, but I'm afraid your transfer to the processing center may be delayed indefinitely. And the weekend meal privileges— He spread his hands helplessly. I may not be able to protect those either. After he left, they sat in crushing silence, each woman grappling with revelations that shattered every assumption they had carried into captivity. The kindness they had experienced at Camp Concordia, the dignity with which they had been treated, the hope for meaningful futures, all of it now felt tainted by the knowledge of what had been done in Germany's name. I didn't know, Liesel whispered finally, tears streaming down her face. My grandmother always said the stories about camps were exaggerated, that they were just work camps for criminals and dissidents. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Greta had withdrawn into herself completely, sitting rigidly upright with her hands clenched in her lap, her face a mask of devastation. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, emptied of all the conviction that had sustained her through years of war and months of captivity. My brother died believing he was fighting for something. Righteous, she said. My father gave everything to the party because he believed we were building a better world. What do I tell them now? How do I live with knowing that their sacrifices were for this? The questions hung unanswered in the air between them, as impossible to resolve as they were to ignore. Outside their window, the familiar sounds of camp life continued, but everything felt different now. The laughter of children playing seemed to mock their grief. The sight of German prisoners working contentedly in gardens felt like a reproach to their shattered understanding of justice. As evening approached, the scent of wood smoke began to drift through their quarters as it had every Friday for weeks. But tonight, instead of anticipation, it brought only the bitter knowledge that they would likely never again be welcome at those gatherings where barriers had begun to dissolve through shared food and tentative friendship. We don't deserve their kindness, Ingrid said finally, voicing what all three were thinking. Not after what we've learned, not after what our people have done. But even as she spoke the words, another part of her mind was remembering Liesel's gentle care of Sarah Matthews, the gratitude in Mrs. Matthews' eyes, the way Captain Harrison's voice had softened when he spoke of their contribution to the camp community. Were those moments meaningless now? Did the crimes committed in Germany's name erase every small act of decency, every bridge built across the divide of war? The questions had no easy answers, and as darkness fell around Camp Concordia, the three women faced the longest night of their captivity, wrestling with truths that would change them forever and wondering if redemption was possible for people like them who had served, however unknowingly, such an irredeemable cause. The days that followed Harrison's revelation passed in a haze of shame and uncertainty that seemed to leach the color from everything around them. The three women moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, performing their duties with mechanical precision while their minds struggled to process the enormity of what they had learned. Conversations became stilted, meals were eaten in silence, and the easy camaraderie they had begun to build with their American captors withered under the weight of their guilt. Word of the concentration camps had spread through the German prisoner population as well, creating divisions and arguments that sometimes erupted into shouting matches in the mess hall. Some refused to believe the reports, clinging to the propaganda that had sustained them through years of war. Others, like Ingrid and her companions, found themselves drowning in the implications of their complicity, however unwitting it might have been. The transfer orders arrived on a gray Monday morning, delivered by a stone-faced corporal who avoided their eyes as he handed the papers to Captain Harrison. Within 48 hours, they would be moved to a facility in Arizona where security was tighter and privileges were fewer. The processing work Liesel had been promised was canceled indefinitely. Their small world of unexpected kindness was coming to an end. That evening, as they packed their few belongings into the same canvas bags they had carried from the transport truck weeks earlier, a soft knock came at their door. Ingrid opened it to find Staff Sergeant James Johnson standing on their threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway but his expression gentle as always. In his hands he carried 3 plates covered with clean kitchen towels, steam rising from beneath the fabric. "Evening, ladies," he said in his soft Memphis drawl, his voice carrying none of the judgment they had feared. "I heard about your transfer orders. Thought you might be hungry." The smell that rose from the plates when he uncovered them was like nothing they had ever experienced. Rich, smoky, complex layers of flavor that spoke of hours of patient cooking, of wood fires tended through long afternoons, of spices and techniques passed down through generations. The meat glistened with a dark, caramelized crust, tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a fork, accompanied by sides that looked foreign but smelled like comfort itself. "I don't understand," Greta said, her voice hoarse from days of suppressed emotion. "After what we learned, after what our people did, why would you show us kindness?" Smoky Joe settled his bulk into the chair they offered, moving with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to make every gesture count. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My grandmother, she was born into slavery down in Mississippi," he began, his eyes distant with memory. "She used to tell me stories about the worst times when folks forgot their humanity and did things that shamed the very soul. But she also told me something else." He paused, looking directly at each of them in turn. "She said that when the world goes dark, somebody's got to keep the light burning. Somebody's got to remember that we're all just people, trying to find our way home." Liesel took a tentative bite of the meat and tears immediately began streaming down her face. Not from the heat, though the spices were unlike anything from her Bavarian childhood, but from the overwhelming realization that this man had spent hours preparing this meal for them, knowing what they now knew about themselves and their country. "This is—" She struggled for words in English, then switched to German, her voice breaking. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Ingrid found herself tasting flavors that seemed to tell a story. The sweetness of brown sugar and molasses, the tang of vinegar, the deep smokiness of hickory wood, all layered together in a harmony that spoke of African roots and American adaptation, of making something magnificent from whatever ingredients life provided. It was a kind of alchemy she had never imagined possible. "How do you make something like this?" she asked, genuinely curious despite her emotional turmoil. Smoky Joe's face lit up with the enthusiasm of a master craftsman discussing his art. "Takes time mostly. Patience. You can't rush good barbecue. The meat knows if you're trying to hurry it along. Got to respect the process. Trust that slow and steady will get you where you need to go." He gestured toward the plates. "These ribs been cooking since before dawn, low and slow over hickory coals." "Your grandmother taught you this?" Greta asked, her usual defensiveness replaced by something approaching reverence. "Some of it." But mostly she taught me why cooking matters. See, my people, we learned to take the worst cuts of meat, the parts nobody else wanted, and turn them into something special, something that brings folks together. His voice grew thoughtful. Food is how we talk when words ain't enough. It's how we show love when everything else is broken. The silence that followed was different from the crushing quiet that had dominated their days since learning about the camps. This was a contemplative stillness, filled with the possibility of understanding rather than the weight of despair. My son Tommy, Smokey Joe continued, he's somewhere over in Italy right now, probably eating K-rations and dreaming of home cooking. I think about him every time I fire up those smokers, wondering if somebody over there might show him a kindness he don't expect. He looked directly at each of them. I figure if I keep treating folks right over here, maybe it comes back around to him somehow. Ingrid set down her fork, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. We don't deserve this, she whispered, not after what our people did. Smokey Joe's expression grew serious but not hard. Maybe not, he said quietly. But deserving ain't really the point, is it? The point is that we're all here right now, sharing this meal, being human together despite everything that says we shouldn't be. He gestured toward their plates. Y'all finish eating now, and remember that somebody thought you were worth the time it took to cook this food right. As they ate in silence, tasting each complex layer of flavor, something fundamental shifted in their understanding of themselves and their place in this strange new world. They were still prisoners, still complicit in their nation's crimes, still facing an uncertain future. But for this moment in this small room filled with the aroma of perfectly smoked meat and unexpected grace, they were also simply three women sharing a meal prepared with love by a man who had chosen compassion over judgment. Outside their window, the Kansas stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering and human kindness alike, while inside, the last barriers between captor and captive finally crumbled beneath the weight of shared humanity.